All right. So this week's Design Corner topic is identifying design issues. So this is going to be largely not specific to, it's not even really specific to working in tabletop games. It's something that you can apply to design basically anywhere, right? So long as we're talking about game design. So video games, board games, tabletop role-playing games, the whole kit and caboodle. That's what we're going to kind of be touching on, just because having done both video game design and tabletop design, it's not that much different in the process. It's just very different in the implementation. Getting something in engine versus writing out the rule and that being basically the end of it. But because we are going to be talking about what is realistically a somewhat negative topic, I do have some ground rules that I want to establish for chat so that way we can make this a smooth experience and not have things become overly negative. So I'm going to throw up some ground rules here. So to start with, we want to stay positive, right? We are talking about problems and issues with design, but this is not the time to now talk about all of the different games that you hate or rules that you hate and things like that. If I'm asking for examples from the chat, or if I see stuff in the chat, we want to make sure this is not the opportunity to, I really hate this one game, so now I'm going to tell everybody about how much I hate this one game because we're talking about design issues. And to that end, I am going to be using examples exclusively from things that I have worked on, right? So this is back to my career in mobile games. This is stuff that I've worked on myself in tabletop for Pinnacle, right? We're going to see a lot of Savage Pathfinder stuff just because I've done a lot of work on Savage Pathfinder recently, and so all those examples are fresh in my mind. And it's also one of the more relevant design elements relevant to the audience that we have here. But I'm not going to be, don't throw it out, hey, talk about how awful that, oh, Landauer. Landauer giving you the boisterous example of don't do this. We're not slagging off other games here. We're talking about design issues and how to identify them. So we're going to focus on work that I've actually done. So that way I'm not picking apart somebody else's design and telling them how awful it is. 2, we're focusing on the work, right? Something that is very easy to have happen in these kinds of discussions is to too much associate the designer with the work. The designer is not the rule. They're not the work. They're not whatever. We are talking about the design, not the person who made the design. So that stuff's also off limits. And then this last one is, unlike the other two, implementation is intent, right? You do not get to go to every single table or every person at home playing on their console and tell them how brilliant your design actually is, right? The way your rule comes across, the way it is read, the way it is commonly understood is the design. Maybe we intended something different, but if it's the way it's being used is ultimately the way it was designed, right? So we'll get into that a little more as we go on, but ultimately we have to get our designs to a point where if I just stick this in front of you, you get it and you play with it with the intent that I had in mind. If my intent and the actuality don't line up and it's negative, that's on me as the designer. So I don't think we'll have a problem, but just so folks know, if you do start jumping into the chat and breaking the rules, then first time we'll time you out, second time we'll ban you. It's as simple as that. Don't have time to waste with any more granularity than that. And if for folks in chat, if you see somebody that's come in later and they're doing this, remind them to read the screen in front of them and to follow the rules. So with that, let us jump into the first thing that we can look at when we're evaluating a design to figure out whether or not it is a good design, a bad design, or a design that needs some revision. So probably the most apparent thing when you're looking at design is how easily can you understand it, right? There is definitely a kind of the first stepping stone on the path to getting to a good design that everybody has to traverse. And especially if you're a more junior designer and you have less experience, this is a problem you'll struggle with, is how do you get your design to the point where somebody reading it thinks and interprets it in the way that you designed it, that cool idea that you had, not the lame way in which they interpret it, right? So to steal a line from Matt Koval of MCDM fame, it's not the lame idea you're thinking of, it's the cool idea I'm thinking of. So language is the first kind of hurdle that we have to overcome, right? So we encountered this, for example, when we were talking about facing for shields in Savage Pathfinder, right? A lot of the designs that we were coming up with of how do we handle this issue, right? We need to address the fact that I'm getting my bonus against too many characters and it doesn't feel realistic and it doesn't feel right. A bunch of the first designs that we were throwing out, the language was kind of obtuse. It was kind of, you didn't immediately understand what you were supposed to do with the rule when it went out there, right? So something like saying, okay, we are going to apply the bonus to a certain number of characters. Well, at what point in the round do I make that distinction, right? And sometimes a lot of these issues are kind of, you just haven't baked the thought enough, right? When do I do something in the round? That is not necessarily an element of it's a bad design, we need to work on the design. It's we started with the first part and we didn't go through all the exceptions, right? Like I was talking about in the pre-stream, a lot of the work that will come up as you're iterating on a design is basically covering all those edge cases and clarifying everything so that it's a self-contained rule. But that's part of the process, right? If I read a rule and I have a whole bunch of questions after I've read that rule, then we have failed to appropriately design it, right? If I have an ability that says I can, to think of an example that we worked on, the death arrow for the arcane archer in Savage Worlds or in Savage Pathfinder. So originally, I don't think we originally had a limiter on it, right? It was you create a death arrow, you shoot it at somebody, they make a vigor roll when it hits them. If they fail, they die. At least I think that was the original design. Well, so there's a whole bunch of questions that come up from that kernel, right? How often can I do that? Can I do that once per day? Can I do that every single encounter? Is there some sort of resource that I have to expend in order for that thing to happen? Can I shoot it with every single shot? What are all of the answers to these questions? Well, if that design went to the final play table, well, now we're asking the GM to make a whole bunch of calls off of the top of their head. They're having to make up rules on the fly. They now have to remember the rulings that they made at that point in that game in perpetuity, so that way the rule is applied consistently, so that way it feels fair to the players. Not super useful for them. So we need to make sure that we cover all of those cases. Well, so here we run into kind of the second issue that is basically every design is going to go through at some point. And as you gain experience as a designer, you'll be able to not really skip over the issue, but basically by the time you say, okay, draft one of this rule is ready, you'll have already addressed a lot of this. So we're getting to draft one. We put our rule out. We've asked a whole bunch of questions, and now we need to answer all of those elements. Well, that means that my rule is getting longer and longer and longer and longer. We're adding more exceptions and this and that, this and that. So if my rule is this long, it probably needs some more design iteration. Generally speaking, and this is kind of, it depends on the environment you're working in. But if you can't say your rule in 2 sentences, then you've not said it well, generally speaking, right? Now, as you get to a deeper game that is more simulationist and has more edge cases, right? If I have to account for every possible variable because I'm making a very simulationist game, then I'm going to have a big block of text no matter what. And no matter how clever I am, because I have to cover every single edge case, my rule is going to be long. But there are often ways in which we can figure out a way to express a rule that covers all those edge cases. So, for example, one of the things that we were trying to figure out when we were many months ago doing kind of the first pass on powers in Savage Pathfinder was how do we allow a player to do something like the alarm spell, for example. So the alarm spell in Pathfinder lasts for a number of hours if you walk through it and you're not a creature that's designated to be able to walk through it by the caster. It sets off some sort of alarm, right? Either a mental note that plays in the head of the caster, an outward auditory alarm, whatever it might be. But it lasts for many hours. The idea being we throw that down when we are resting in camp for our long rest. And if anybody tries to sneak in, if we don't have a sentry, then the mage gets alerted. If you have a watch, then it augments and basically helps out folks that are on watch by making sure that you've got a second line of defense. Well, so most of the powers by default in Suede do not support play in terms of minutes and hours, right? Most of them are designed for in the moment tactical combat in an encounter. And we were seeing this crop up with a bunch of different powers. Well, so the first thought, the easy solution, the obvious solution, is let us go through every single power that we want to have this extended duration and give it a new power modifier, right? So if we want invisibility and we want detect conceal arcana and we want, I'm failing to think of other examples, but we can just run with those too. If we want both of those, intangibility, we could have, say, fly, maybe, all of those. Maybe we want to allow the player to have those last in minutes and hours as opposed to round to round to round. And we could just go through and add modifiers, but think about how much space we are now adding over everything. Every single power that we want to have this extended duration is now going to have that modifier listed under there. Well, again, it's easy, but it means that we're adding a lot of work, we're adding a lot of space, and now I have to track which abilities do and do not have duration. Well, one of the things we tried is there a way for us to word a universal duration modifier? I'm sorry, there is one moment. There's something just driving me crazy. I think it was a bit of cat hair, as the cats do like to prowl around here. But we've got maybe, oh my goodness, sorry. It's just driving me absolutely insane. That's why I keep messing with my nose. So maybe there's a way we can word how this universal modifier works in such that it is understood which abilities it can and cannot be used with. So we probably spent, I probably spent a couple of hours trying, probably like 2 hours, trying to figure out how to word this and another universal modifier that we were thinking of adding. The other universal modifier being a delayed activation, which I think actually made it into the book. I forget off the top of my head if it did or not. But basically, the other idea being, how would you do, say, like a glyph of warding, right? You put down the glyph, and then after somebody walks within a proximity, it explodes and does a whole bunch of damage, right? Things like that. Well, that could also be individual modifiers under individual powers. But if a third of the powers that we have, we want to be able to have this delayed modifier attributed to it, we should probably figure out a way to make it universal as opposed to a specific instance under a third of our powers. One of the things that you kind of have to learn to accept, right, is even though you've identified an issue, there's not always an elegant solution. And so this was one of those examples where maybe give it enough time and working with, I was going to say working with the right people. That sounds like the people I was working with were insufficient. But really what I mean is working with enough people so that somebody comes up with the right wording or idea, right? There's if you're a professional designer, then a lot of the getting to the right rule, the right design that actually works and is is easy to understand and brief and doesn't require a whole lot of explanation and is generally always fun. The whole reason of being a professional designer and why we pay people to be professional designers is they will get to that point eventually, right? They will continue to work and iterate on the issue and ultimately get to the point where the design follows those guidelines. If you're not a working professional, then you can probably get there, but it's basically kind of a matter of luck. It's, do you have the epiphany of like, oh, I just realized what we could do that is going to make this rule short, concise, easy to understand, and fun. And even for professional designers, sometimes it's a matter of, I'm not going to get to that point, but if I go and I talk to my colleague over here, they might be struck with inspiration or be in the right headspace or see the issue from a different angle that results in, okay, this is a problem that we can solve, and here's how we solve it. So given enough time to just iterate on it, or working with enough people that I happen to luck across the person that has that moment of epiphany and inspiration and realizes this is the wording we should use, we could probably have gotten to a point where we had a universal modifier and it was worded in such a way that it was apparent which powers it applied to and which it didn't. But we didn't have the time or resources to go through such an exhaustive process for something as simple as a power modifier that we want to throw in a bunch of things. So you also have to be ready, even if you've identified the issue. Identifying the issue does not mean it needs to be solved. Identifying the issue means you know what you're working with. And in that instance, we just had to put it down, right? There were other things that we needed to work on that were a higher priority, right? Like adding in new powers that cover the portfolio that we didn't currently have. And we have a solution. It's not the best, most elegant solution, right? But it's also certainly not a solution that we hate that we just have to live with. Putting on specific modifiers for specific powers is something we do all the time. So it's not controversial that that's how we would handle this. But we recognized that there's probably a more clever way to word this to make it more universal and to make it something that we don't have to have, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. So we can identify that this design is going to be problematic if the design is not easily understood upon first reading, right? If I have to ask a whole bunch of questions in order to fully understand the rule. And that right there is one of the major benefits of designing collaboratively, right? Working as a team to understand this issue and come up with a solution. That's why we have, 5 or 6 people working on all of the iterations of the design on Pathfinder. Because I'm going to come at it from one angle, you're going to come at it from a different angle, and you're going to ask different questions than I did, right? In the process of writing whatever rule I'm working on, I have asked myself a bunch of questions of, okay, well, when can I use this ability? How often can I use this ability? But I'm not going to ask all of the questions. So having other people that have different perspectives on it, they get to ask questions, and you also get to kind of rubber ducky them. So for folks that don't know, rubber duckying it's literally descended from, I think it's originally a programming term. But basically, one of the most valuable things you can do when you're working on an issue is just talk it out, right? The act of verbalizing it and expressing it is going to help you understand it, and it's going to help you to come to a solution. And so programmers would take a little rubber ducky and put it at their desk, and they would talk to the rubber ducky, and they would explain the issue that they're running into to the rubber ducky, basically, so that way it didn't seem like they were crazy and just talking to themselves. And in explaining this issue to something that you view as an outside perspective, right? The other element of having something to explain to as opposed to talking to yourself is you already understand the different facets of the issue. By pretending that duck has no idea what you're talking about, that will help you figure out in your head, what do I need to explain to understand this issue? And by the time you get to the end of your explanation, that probably generates a bunch of ideas on how to solve it. And I'm pretty bad about this. I will literally start talking about, okay, well, we could do this thing, and I will start talking through point by point by point, and then I'll come to the question where I do not have a good solution, and I will trail off in the middle. I'll think for a moment and say, yeah, no, never mind, that's not going to work, right? But the meeting would probably go faster and be a little more efficient if I just thought about it inside my own head and not taken up the floor time to work through the problem, but that's just the way I work oftentimes. So if we can't talk through the issue, if we can't read through the design and understand all the facets without asking a whole bunch of questions, we know there's a potential problem. If when I am reading it, I do not, when I'm reading it, if I have to read a lot of it to get a little bit of information, right? There's a thing called the signal to noise ratio. I think this is originally from, sorry, one moment. Yes, Mike, I am doing the stream right now. I think he needs something from me for the play test. So, where was I? The signal to noise ratio. So I think this is descendant from literally radio, where how much information do I transmit, right? How much can you understand versus how much is washed out and static and so on, right? The idea is I'm trying to give you directions on the radio so you can get to a location, and do you hear half of what I say, right? And I have to repeat myself multiple times for you to hear the entire message, or do you hear everything on the first instance? Well, if you have a very low signal to noise ratio, then it should be low. A low signal to noise ratio, which means you have a little bit of signal or a lot of signal and sorry, I'm trying to use the appropriate term. If we have a lot of signal and a little bit of noise, then our number is large, which means we have a large ratio, in which case I'm getting a lot of information without having to read a whole lot. If I have a low signal to noise ratio, then thank you, people are throwing in the math for me. The lower your signal to noise ratio is, the more I have to read, right? So if all I am trying to understand is, again, using the shield example, when I'm being attacked, I get to use my shield against half of the people attacking me. If I have to read 4 or 5 bullets to completely understand it, then we have a very low signal to noise ratio. There's a lot of language in there that we probably don't need, that we can cut and condense down into 1 or 2 bullets. If you can't say it quickly, then you probably haven't said it well. So those are kind of the two really big, especially early designer issues that you run into. I have not fully stated the idea. I do not have the detail where I need it. And then I have too much detail, and they're kind of contradictory issues, right? We're always trying to make our rules as short and concise as possible, because that means that you don't check out. How many times, you open up the manual for something, right? I think of, like putting together a desk even, or the shelf behind me. Open up the manual. I start on page 1. I start reading of how to put it together. And how quickly do I close it and just start putting it together, because I don't want to read through the whole thing. If you have long rules, if you have complex design that requires a lot of explanation, then people will check out. We encounter this all the time in video games. How much of our rules do we need to explain up front so that you can make informed decisions in the game? If you need to understand how our movement system works, and how our combat system works, and how armor works, and how weapons work, and all of those things in character creation, because you're going to be putting points into values, then that's not necessarily the best, right? Because you are going to make decisions based on imperfect knowledge, and you are going to then later regret it because you're locked into the decisions you made early on. Also, but on the flip side, if your tutorial is 20 minutes long and you're explaining all the minutia, nobody's going to pay attention to it. People are going to skip through the text, and because they just want to get to the fun part, they want to play the game. So by making your rules narrower, more concise, you increase the likelihood that people are going to understand it and have fun with it. And this kind of also ties into the third thing that is kind of I guess it's more of an identifier. It really is issues 1 and 2. It's just another way to see that those are the problems. Every time you present the rule to somebody, they use it incorrectly. If we put a rule in front of somebody and they start playing with it and they start utilizing it and they use it incorrectly, then it's not necessarily a fault of the end user, right, of the player, that they didn't understand the rule and they used it incorrectly. It's we did not sufficiently present the design in a simple enough, straightforward enough way that you understood it. This is especially easy to illustrate in the lens of video games, right? Especially with level design. If we have a Y intersection and we want the player to go left, but all of our players go right and then have to come to a dead end and then have to trek backwards, we have to figure out, okay, why is everybody doing that? We can't just wash our hands and say, okay, our players are not paying attention, they're not engaged, it's somehow the fault of the player that everybody goes down the right corridor. What did we do that sorry, Mike, this is the second time you've done this to me, except this time he's in Twitch chat. The reason everybody's going right instead of left is because we put all the lights on the right path and the left path is dark. Well, because people tend to navigate towards the light, that's why everybody's going right. So we need to reevaluate our design. We need to relight the split so that way the light is in the place we want people to go, the darkness is in the place we don't want them to go, and now people are going to start heading in the direction. And to share with everybody how Mike distracted me for a second time this stream, he said, I have never had to reclarify a rule I write. They're easy to understand the first time, every time. Mike should also follow that up with a message that says, one part of me always lies, the other part of me also always lies. That's something that it's just a natural element of being a designer, and it's also why it's kind of why I titled this stream the way I did, where we're identifying design issues. It's not about fixing problems, right? Because realistically speaking, very rarely are you at the point in a design where you actually have to fix a problem. That's really in the last 10% of the design. That's the stuff that we're largely dealing with now, right? Of actually, yes and no, largely dealing with. I find it's fairly rare that you build a design and then people get their hands on it and then you realize that that design did not do at all what you intended it to do and it is broken. And at that point, we have to go in and fix it. Usually speaking, it's you need to tweak it and clarify it, right? Like I was talking about in the 10 minutes of the pre-stream, a lot of the work we're doing right now on Savage Pathfinder that is kind of, the based on the feedback we got since V11 is basically just bookkeeping. It's okay, let's sync up, these numbers, and we've changed the design for this thing, and that has this trickle down effect where all of these numbers or positions or values or the way we word these things have to change, right? For instance, what was something we just changed? It just happened. Maybe it's the way we note armor interference. Well, that did change. I don't know if that's as big a change as I'm thinking of it, but armor interference, we clarified the way we word it, right? That, for instance, if you're not allowed to wear any armor, it's armor interference none, as opposed to saying the starting category of the armor that you can't wear. Well, that means that we have to go through everywhere and update that. So there's a lot of things that they look like problems to be fixed, but in reality, it's just kind of bookkeeping and updating. It's rare that, okay, we presented this rule and the rule itself is just broken, especially when you're working in those team environments. So Colin 1012 asked a question, how bad is the, quote, I know what I meant factor, end quote, where it isn't clear because you know what you meant, it seems, where it isn't clear, but because you know what you meant, it seems clear to you. So that is something that is both it's largely an element of experience, but it is also an element of explanation. And it's for two reasons. So the experience part is, as you do more design, you get more and more into the mindset of thinking about how other people are going to perceive the design, When I was teaching at the university, I would ask my students, and actually, let's run this exercise here. Chat, what do you think is the single most important skill for a game designer to have? And I will give folks a moment to answer, and I will hydrate. And do not be afraid to throw out answers. It's really not a will you get it wrong. I think I taught at the university for a year and a half, probably over 100 students. And the question is, what is the most important skill trait for a game designer to have? So I think in over 100 students, I don't know that I've had anybody say, maybe once, the correct response. And even then, usually it's not as simply as I put it. So we've got some literacy, flexibility, communication, but Havenheart is getting to what the core of it is, how to think like a player. And I boil this down to having lots of empathy, right? At the end of the day, all empathy is the ability to take yourself and put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And that is really, at the end of the day, the job of a game designer on a project, is to take themselves, put themselves in the shoes of the player, and then to experience the design as that player would, and to understand how they're going to react to it, understand how they're going to perceive it, how they're going to use it, how they're going to play with it, what their experience is going to be. Yeah, Havenheart said, same as being a programmer. I would wager a lot of programmers would argue with you, and they would all be wrong, because you're absolutely right. The programmer has to be able to understand what's the end user going to do in order to make the system robust enough for usage. And Tom Miskey said, thinking like both a player and GM. That's certainly especially true for tabletop role-playing games, right? When I was teaching at the college, it was for video games, so you don't have GMs in video games. And but that's only, I think, more important in tabletop games than in video games, because at the end of the day, in video games, your controls are constrained, right? I can press these buttons, I can move these sticks, I can pull these triggers, I can move this D-pad, and that is what I have to interact with your game. Versus a tabletop game where anything I can come up with, I can theoretically do in that game. John Doom, 100%, although that'll put a lot of QA people out of work. That's one of those things where there's a lot of folks that do not put enough value in their QA folks, because their QA folks, a good QA person is also has a lot of empathy. They're able to imagine themselves as a lot of different people. And traditionally, we don't think of that as being the most valuable skill. We would rather think of the ability to type lines of code per minute as the most valuable skill. But so, since I need to be able to put myself into the shoes of the player, of the GM, of the other designers that are working with me, that's something that you just kind of accumulate as you spend time as a designer, right? There's a not insignificant portion of being a professional game designer that your job is to basically, it's kind of like being a writer, in that your job is to collect people, right? To collect experiences and understanding and things of that nature, so that way you can improve your design. I find personally, and maybe this is not true for everybody, but the thing that I see most often of the type of content that game designers consume is a lot of autobiographical content, or a lot of biographical content and autobiographical content, a lot of documentaries, a lot of psychological type work, right? I know a lot of people that work as professional designers that have some sort of degree or another in psychology, because understanding other perspectives allows you to make more robust designs. How is the player going to read that? Landauer asked a good question: who's the primary consumer / user of published RPG material, game masters or players? that's something that we have to be very clear that we delineate when we're working on a design. Who are we thinking about, right? Your player is going to engage with the core rules just like your GM will. So you need to think about both of them, right? And this is something that uh, this formulation is the way Shane says it all the time is, that's fine if we want the player to be able to do that. It's just also the bad guys are going to do that too, right? And so the tools that we give the players, we also give the bad guys. And actually, sorry, the way Shane usually says it is in the reverse, right? We're talking about giving some tools to the bad guys, and like that's fine if we want the bad guys to be able to do that, but the players are going to be able to do that too, because they're both working under the shared assumption of rules. So kind of your core content is going to everybody, but the moment you get off the beaten path, and off the beaten path, I mean the not core rules, when you're talking about bestiaries and adventure paths and things of that nature, the GM is your core consumer. And it's kind of this weird tension in tabletop, because a lot of the stuff you put out is something that only one person is going to buy, right? If you've got a group of 5 players, there's one GM, and they're going to buy core rules and the bestiary and the companion and the adventure path and the expansion for the bestiary and the additional situational rules and all those things, right? So you're selling to 1 out of 5 people. But the stuff that makes you the most money is the stuff that you can sell to all 5 people. So we kind of have to bounce back and forth. Though I think, generally speaking, we err on the side of the GM, because the GM of everybody at the table has the hardest job. The GM has to make sure that all 5 of the people at the table, well, not really all 5, they have to make sure 4 of the 5 people at the table are having fun. Very often as a GM, you will sacrifice your own fun for your players because you're facilitating all of that. So we tend to err on the side of the GM, but definitely it's got to be fun for the players too. Otherwise, why are they going to play the game? But so you kind of accumulate this experience and basically this empathy. I generally find, and this is something I can say I'm fairly proud of. My career as a game designer, I feel, has made me a better person, because I've had more empathy for other people, and I understand more people's world experiences, and I'm less judgmental now. And there's, just as you understand more and more people and their experiences, it's harder to be sour on people and to dismiss them and things like that. So you've got kind of that part of, and actually let's scroll back up to the original question so we don't lose too much focus. But so part of the I know what I meant factor is kind of dependent on that experience level, right? For a less experienced designer, they're going to throw that out there, and especially if they're working with less experienced designers, they're going to throw that out there, and they're going to run into a roadblock, right? One of the benefits of working with experienced professionals, and this is something that I'm quite enjoying now as opposed to previously in teaching and working with a lot of like student internship programs and stuff like that. Experienced designers don't immediately try and think of whatever you throw out there as the lame thing that they're thinking of. They try and figure out, how is this the cool thing you're thinking of, right? So that way we don't need to have a fully formed idea when we throw it out there. It also makes it a lot easier to do something that I absolutely love, which is to just basically throw something crazy out there. I all the time will say, okay, I think this is a crazy idea, and we don't want to do this, but maybe this will make somebody think of something. And then I say an idea that is, we're looking for something at a 5, and I just threw out an idea that's at a 15, right? But by throwing out that extreme, that sparks conversation and the ability to work off of those extreme notions, and often dialing it back, right? Like we talked about with Mike about the powers in Savage Worlds. We can, throw everything up and make all the changes and then dial it back down, and that's a lot easier than going the other way. The kind of other side to that is, again, that issue that we talked about very early on of, if too much of your design is predicated on your own focal point, right? We're trying to solve issue X, and in solving issue X, it's kind of cutting your nose off to spite your face, right? We want to solve the problem of our nose. And so we'll do all of these changes and jump through all these hoops to fix that problem, to solve it. But we've massacred the rest of our face in order to solve that one issue, because now the nose is the only thing that still functions and looks anything like we want it to. That's something that kind of one of the initial big changes we made to spellcasting. The notion that you don't get back 5 power points every hour was kind of that, let's ratchet it to 11. Let's really try it. And that was actually solving all of the solutions that we came up, solving and solved all of the solutions that we came up with in order to deal with that central issue, right? That was the moment when we made changes to how some powers worked, and we were messing around with how stacking worked, and we were changing how some encounters worked and the abilities of different creatures. And we were all trying to solve this issue of that we now recognize as basically, for the amount of armor that is available, protection and deflection are way too powerful for the game to continue to be robust and fun, right? In Deadlands, if somebody gets a raise on protection as the original wording, they get a +4 to their toughness. Well, they were probably just wearing clothes, right? They did not have any armor. They only had their own inherent toughness. So those 4 points are necessary. Well, if I can get those 4 points by default just by throwing on some plate mail, and I don't think the number lines up there, but this is just an example, and then I get an extra 4 points on top of it, then that no longer is a valuable solution. And so we spent a lot of time trying to basically figure out, how do we solve this macro solution as if it was a problem of the entire system, of what happens when you've got really heavy armor and really heavy, really large boosts to your toughness through spellcasting. In reality, the solution was not, we need to somehow make it so that you can have both things be true at the same time. It was, we just need to make one true or the other. And so having the heavier armors is an element of medieval fantasy games, right? So we want to make sure we keep that. So instead of trying to fix everything else, we want to fix the one small thing that actually will solve the issue, right? And so we went through a bunch of rule changes. We changed, we got rid of getting PowerPoints back on bennies. We went to the much longer rest mechanic, so that way you weren't getting your PowerPoints back between every single encounter. We were making all these buffs to the bad guys. And all of these elements were to fix, realistically, this one problem. Protection and deflection are too powerful for usage in this setting as everything else exists. And that's kind of one of the other things that you should be looking out for, is solving your own solutions and solving too many solutions at once. So there's 2 elements to that. And so let's start with the first one, which is solving your own solutions. This is something I encountered all the time in mobile design, especially in UI. We need to be able to present X to the player, right? Or we want them to be able to customize this thing. We then need to create a solution for when they customize that stuff to still show the information we need, right? So I want them to be able to, think if you're playing an MMO, which the thing I worked on was basically an MMO just without the multiplayer, but it was all the other elements of it, right? And so we had to be able to display certain pieces of information to the player at any point. But because it's an expectation that you have, that the player should be able to move around their user interface and to customize it to be useful for their setup, that's an ability that we gave the players. Well, we solved the solution of, there's a lot of information. We want the players to be able to put the information where they want so they can read it and parse it and understand it. But now we're solving the solution that we created of allowing we solve the problem of there's too much info, so we need to let our players move around the UI. And now we need to solve our solution of letting them move around the UI because they're hiding the information that we need to give them. we're solving our own solution at that point. In reality, what you need to do is don't give them the customization. No, I did not work on My Time as Portia. It's a edutainment project that never actually released. It was basically supposed to be like an MMO, but for learning math. It was using all the like grinding out skills in games like World of Warcraft, except instead of clicking on the rock 10,000 times to increase your mining to get the better ore to get the better armor, you did math puzzles in order to get your ore to increase your mining to get better ore to get the better armor. But we're solving the solution that we added to solve the problem, which means that the original solution was not the correct solution. So if you're solving the things that you're adding into the game, then that means that you've added the wrong things into the game. And realistically, you should take a couple of steps back and re-identify what that original issue is and come up with a different solution. I actually this isn't something I worked on, but this is an example I will use because it's a really good example. So one of my colleagues at Colin 1012, a massively multiplayer math online role-playing game, is this something that needs to happen. Yeah, base more or less. It's just get rid of the massive and multiplayer, and the math online role-playing game is what we were working on. I'm gonna pause the example I was gonna give to address what Havenheart just said. If they hit it, it's on them. I know that's not the preferred answer. Man, you're such a programmer. That's again kind of harkens back to that earlier point I made of you can't. The implementation is the intent, right? You can't go to everybody that's using your product and say, well, no, you're the fool because you hid the thing that you needed to have on screen. We're not the fools for letting you hide the thing. The user is not responsible for using the tools as we presented. The designer is. So we need to make sure that oh god, sorry, I get distracted by Mike's comment, but we need to make sure that we're presenting things in a way that is useful. I will get to what Mike just said because that snowball effect can be painful. But so one of my colleagues at the university, the head of the game design program, his example of solving your own solutions was he was working through this thought experiment. Trash in, trash out. That's a great line, Havenheart. But he was working through this thought experiment with some students. They were talking about adding in basically the thing that they did in Red Dead Redemption 2, where your hair grows over time, right? To make it a little more realistic and to show the passage of time, right? The issue they were trying to solve is in an MMO, how do we show that time has passed between the different missions, right? Because very often you're playing an MMO and everything feels like it's happening on the same day because there's not really a good indication of the passage of time. They're like, oh, well, we'll have the character's hair and beard grow out. But then as they got talking, they were like, well, but people will want to customize their character and they don't want to have to go to a barber shop all the time because now they have to go back to town all the time for this cosmetic thing. And that's going to be annoying. And so people are going to have long hair and long beards when they don't want them. So what if we put in a little thing in the UI under the character customizer that basically automatically trims their beard and their hair so that it does not grow past the length they want? Well, at that point, what was the point of having the hair growth in the first place, right? You at this point have introduced another mechanic to solve the fact that people are going to be dissatisfied because they want their custom character to look like X. And now it no longer solves the issue of you're trying to show passage of time in this game. So if we're solving our own solutions, that means our original solution wasn't actually the right one. I'm going to wait on Mike's thing because that's another important thing to identify with your design. But so we're solving our own solutions. And then the shaving minigame. A thing to look out for is, are you solving your own solutions? I forget the formulation. I forgot the formulation that I used before, so I'm just going to move on, as opposed to try and recall it. And it kind of ties into what Mike said. So I'm just that's not the comment I wanted. So I'm just going to go from Mike's wording as a trying to remember the wording I used before. So Mike said the fun part is when you solve a problem, but solving it reveals another problem you didn't realize you had. So this comes in two flavors, right? And this is, design is complex. That's why anytime we talk about anything, I always say this comes in two flavors. There's multiple flavors of basically every problem that you can encounter. But so option A is the problems that you're revealing are not actually because they were always problems, but rather because your new design has created a whole bunch of problems. Option B is those were always problems. We just weren't in a situation to recognize it. So I think option B is actually a little easier to go over. So I'll hit that first. Basically, kind of thinking back to the shield facing stream we did a couple of weeks ago now. Shields didn't come up enough for us to identify that knowing facing for dealing with melee attackers was enough of a problem that we really needed to create a solution for it. As you encounter different usages of your design, you will see new problems pop up, right? And this is what makes playtesting and user feedback so incredibly valuable and useful. We didn't think about this combination of abilities, or we didn't think about how this ability would interface with this subsystem. But now that we've seen the players do it, we need to make our own evaluation, right? Are the things that they're doing things we're okay with? So, for example, and this was not something that came to us from surprise, we knew this going in. When we released the original version of the rules, a bunch of people brought up how it seemed like the rogue and the monk were a little bit broken, and that their class abilities work together too well. Because with the rogue, if my target is vulnerable, then I get an extra d6 of damage against them. And something I can do as the monk is if I hit you and I get a raise, I can make you distracted or vulnerable. So if you're a rogue monk, I can hit you, make you vulnerable, and then I get my bonus damage against you. And so those two abilities will work together very well and always be a really great combination. And we recognize that going in. And so a bunch of people were like, oh, hey, this seems like it's way too good. This probably shouldn't be something that could happen. But before we ever put out the design, we made the evaluation. Those combinations, right, of where edge A and edge B can come together and be really powerful are actually kind of the things that we want, right? That's the whole point of having the very easy to, grab different edges system that Savage Worlds has, is those interactions are part of the juice. We want our players to realize, oh, if I take this edge and this edge, I can have this really cool interaction, right? We want players to recognize that if I take Rapid Shot and I'm an Arcane Archer, I can use two different of my Arcane Archer abilities on each arrow. I can use ability 1 on arrow 1, ability 2 on arrow 2. As I often tried to do when I was playtesting the Arcane Archer, I would use my first arrow to cast a spell through it, to cast Havoc, to make my target distracted. So that way they would have a -2 on the Vigor roll when I hit them with my second arrow, which was the Death arrow. So now they've got a -2 on the Vigor roll, as opposed to it just being a straight Vigor roll. Those interactions are things that we want. When you can say, oh, that is as intended, we're good to go, your design is fine. If you see those interactions happening and you're not okay with it, you need to step not back to the point where you're working on those specific abilities, but to the step before, right? You want to make sure that the initial assumption of you can kind of mix and match and grab these things from wherever is how you want your design to work. If the answer had been no, maybe we need to, again, this was never on the table and was never the thought. But if the issue we were always coming up with is when people multi-class, that creates a lot of issues and breaks the game, then probably the best solution would just be to say you can't multi-class, right? It reduces player freedom, but it solves the core issue versus going through and redesigning every single core class edge so that it doesn't create a problem with multi-classing. But again, that wasn't actually the issue, so we didn't ever have to do that. But the other part of the issue that Mike brings up, right, is sometimes it's not the robustness of the system. Sometimes it's not the original design that is at issue. Sometimes it's your solution. Well, yeah, Havenheart, that is the point of the multi-class. That's why I said it's not a problem that we had to solve. I was just using that as an illustrative example. We want multi-classing to be cool and for, I use ability A and ability B and there's an interaction. But so sometimes it's not the underlying system that you reveal to have that strain, right? We don't actually need to worry about shield facing because that's not an issue of the system, it's an issue of the specific implementation. And kind of it can be sometimes difficult to evaluate, are we solving the system or are we solving the specific implementation? And that's why basically the solution for both is the same thing. Very often the first instinct is let's just fix this specific implementation, and that will allow us to correct the overall issue. That'll get us the issue that's in front of us out of the way. And honestly, as a designer, that's probably what you do by gut 85% of the time. The thing that is very useful for designers to remember, and you're basically going to have to be constantly reminded of this, until you've got 30, 40 years under your belt of doing game design, is you should always, even if you're not verbalizing it and spending a whole lot of time on it, but just take a moment and think, take a step back past the specific implementation and think of the system as a whole. And evaluate, is this actually a problem of this implementation or is it a problem of the system? There are multiple times over the course of Savage Pathfinder where we at some point probably should have stepped back and said, okay, what's the actual, is this a problem with this edge or this new rule or this power? Or is this a problem with the way the system interfaces with this thing that is happening? So it's something that it's basically a mistake that every designer makes all the time and will forever make their entire career, but it is something that we should try and catch ourselves on. Even if it takes you, only 60 seconds to consider, is this a system issue or an implementation issue? That step is super valuable for us to go through because it allows us to avoid spending, we spent a month and a half, I want to say, probably in total, addressing what boiled down to being the protection deflection issue. If we take a couple of steps back earlier on, we might have gotten to the design that actually solved everything sooner and have been able to work on other stuff, right? But again, it's the mistake that you are always going to make as a designer all the time, and basically never escape. It felt longer. I everything feels longer and simultaneously shorter, right? That's the lockdown quarantine life. But I do think it was only like a month and a half because I think it was basically that section of book 3 that we played twice. That was 2 different weeks, and then the week leading in and the week leading out. I think it was about 4 to 6 weeks where we're working on that one issue. Ooh. Okay. Well, that yeah, Mike said things that feel good at novice can feel really bad at veteran. That's the other thing that you're always gonna have to deal with the spread. So I was about to talk about the next topic of Design Corner. Okay. So, because Mike just messaged me privately on Hangouts and said if I'm free Saturday, we could do a bonus episode to talk about new changes and spellcasters, which sounds like something that'd be really fun for you folks. So, The next episode of Design Corner is going to be a bonus episode this Saturday. Time TBD. Well, actually, how does this same time, Mike? 2 p.m. Arizona time. I think that's 3 p.m. your time. I have a hard out at 5 because that's when my okay. Mike says sounds good. My tabletop game on Saturday starts at 5 p.m. my time. So the next episode of Design Corner will be a bonus Design Corner talking about the latest and greatest changes to Savage Pathfinder. And that will be on Saturday at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, because we're in the Pacific time zone right now, which makes that 5 p.m. Eastern, not Standard Time, Daylight Time. And then the topic for the next regularly scheduled episode of Design Corner, which is Thursdays, the Thursday episode is actually going to be linked into that. I am going to be talking about, and maybe this will change depending on how much we get into. I don't know if we'll get into the process super much on Saturday, but I was planning on talking about what was the process of design to iteration to release to feedback to iteration to release that we went through in the Savage Pathfinder dev team, going through all of the different versions that you folks have seen, right? So not talking about specific issues, but rather the overall process. There's a chance, and I just realized my monitor's a little crooked, there's a chance that maybe Mike and I will get into that on Saturday, in which case check out the weekly Tuesday newsletter. You can sign up for that on the PEG site if you are not already. That you get the latest news from PEG, and that also includes the announcement for the next Design Corners topic. So if it changes, you will see it there. Otherwise, Saturday, 2 p.m. Pacific Standard, 5 p.m. Eastern, or not Pacific Standard, Pacific Daylight, 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight. We'll be doing a bonus episode with Mike Barbeau of Savage Pathfinder fame. And then on Thursday, we'll be talking about the process that got us to those changes that we will be talking about on Saturday. Until then, I will see you folks later.